The Call to the Wild. Zach Evans stared at the message on his datapad, disbelief and curiosity mixing in equal measure. A few weeks earlier, he'd received an urgent request from the Intergalactic Wildlife Rehabilitation Society, a group dedicated to the preservation of some of the galaxy's most endangered and dangerous species. Their latest request was something far outside his usual territory, a trip to the planet Vorx, known for its unforgiving landscape and even more fearsome creatures. The target of his mission, an alien wolf-like beast called Fang. Fang was no ordinary animal. Once a prized weapon in an ancient interspecies conflict, Fang was now a relic, a symbol of an era that the galaxy wanted to forget. After the war ended, his caretakers either perished in battle or abandoned him, leaving him trapped in the crumbling remnants of the Vorxian Zoo. Most saw Fang as a monster, a savage creature to be contained and forgotten, but not Zach. In his years of working with the wildest animals on Earth, he'd never encountered a creature he couldn't connect with in some way, and this challenge, the abandoned, hostile alien wolf, intrigued him deeply. The transport ship touched down on the cracked, dusty surface of Vorx with a rough jolt, pulling Zach out of his thoughts. As the doors hissed open, he braced himself against the harsh gust of the planet's icy winds. Outside, a bleak landscape stretched as far as he could see, red dust and barren terrain under a dim sky, with no sign of life. The sight was dismal, and Zach could almost feel the isolation that must have seeped into Fang's bones after years of solitude. Waiting at the edge of the landing pad was Kyra, a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense woman who looked him up and down with a mixture of skepticism and surprise. "You're the human they sent," she asked, folding her arms across her chest. "You do realize this isn't some Earth zoo, right?" Zach smiled faintly, undeterred. "I've heard the stories, but Fang deserves a chance, just like any creature. It sounds like he's been abandoned and left to fend for himself in here." Kyra's expression softened for a moment. Abandoned is putting it lightly. He's more like a ticking bomb. Most people who've tried to handle him barely made it out in one piece. But Zach was already looking past her, toward the large enclosure towering ominously in the distance. As Kyra led him through the decrepit grounds of the Vorx Zoo, he took in the faded signs, broken fencing, and debris scattered from storms and time. The zoo had clearly been a place of grandeur once, but now it was more like a ruin, reclaimed by nature and neglect. Finally, they reached the imposing enclosure that housed Fang. The air was thick with an ominous silence as Zach approached, hearing a low, deep growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath him. Fang was massive, much larger than any wolf Zach had ever seen on Earth, with gleaming, molten gold eyes that fixed on him the moment he entered his line of sight. Silver fur, now dull and matted, covered his powerful body, and his teeth glinted in the dim light, visible even at a distance. "That's him," Kyra said softly, keeping a wary distance. "Are you really going to go in there?" Zach nodded, gathering his gear and steeling himself. "He looks dangerous, but I can see something else. A creature that's been left to suffer alone. I'm going in." With a heavy clank, the gate closed behind him, sealing him into the enclosure with the ferocious alien beast. Fang's growl deepened as he locked eyes with Zach, a predator sizing up potential prey. For a moment, the air was tense, thick with the possibility of sudden violence. But Zach knew this was no time for sudden moves or fear. He kept his posture relaxed, speaking softly, "Easy, big guy. I'm not here to hurt you." Slowly he crouched down, opening his bag to retrieve a small container of raw meat, fresh and bloody. He placed it carefully on the ground, making it clear he wasn't about to approach or force anything. Fang's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, his gaze flickering between the meat and Zach. The massive wolf was still, assessing, but then, with surprising caution, he approached the offering. His jaws parted slightly, revealing sharp, lethal teeth, but he lowered his head and took a bite, his eyes never leaving Zach's. Zach felt his heart pounding, but he remained calm, relieved that the first encounter hadn't ended in disaster. Good boy, he murmured, his voice low and steady. I'm here to help. Fang's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was a glint of curiosity in them now, a slight thawing of the cold hostility he had initially shown. Zach knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey, and that trust wouldn't come easily with a creature so damaged by isolation and fear. Once Fang had finished the meat, Zach reached into his bag again, this time pulling out a grooming brush. He held it out for Fang to see, taking care to keep his movements slow and measured. He had no illusions about the danger. One wrong move, and Fang could easily snap him in half. But Zach's instincts told him that this creature was more than just a wild beast. You've been alone for too long, he said softly. Let's see if you'll let me help you. Fang's ears perked up slightly, his posture tense but not aggressive. Slowly, he moved closer, his snout brushing against Zach's outstretched hand as if testing him. Zach held his breath, feeling the weight of the creature's decision. Then, to his surprise, Fang allowed the brush to touch his matted fur, and Zach began to work carefully, smoothing out the tangles and grime. To Zach's astonishment, Fang didn't pull away or attack. Instead, he let out a low, almost contented rumble as Zach continued to brush, working his way carefully through the neglected fur. It was a tentative, fragile moment of trust, a first step toward breaking down the walls that isolation had built up. As Zach worked, he could see how emaciated and neglected Fang truly was. Beneath the matted fur, his muscles had grown lean and worn, and his coat was dull and lifeless. Years of loneliness had taken their toll, but there was strength in him, a resilience that Zach recognized. They were both outsiders, he realized. Zach, the human who had chosen to take on a job no one else wanted, and Fang, the alien beast abandoned by a galaxy that had once prized him. Here, on this desolate planet, they had found an unexpected understanding. After what felt like hours, Zach put the brush down, aware that he couldn't push Fang's patience too far in one day. He stood slowly, giving the creature space, and nodded to himself, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Fang had let him in, however briefly, and that small victory gave him hope. The gate opened again, and Zach stepped out, his heart still racing. Kyra was waiting, her arms crossed and an unreadable expression on her face. I don't know how you did that, she said, shaking her head in disbelief, but I've never seen him let anyone get that close. Zach smiled faintly, still feeling the thrill of his encounter. I just gave him a chance. He's not as dangerous as everyone thinks. He's just misunderstood. As he walked back to his quarters that night, Zach felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that gaining Fang's trust would be a long, arduous process, but he was ready. And as he lay awake, planning his next move, he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this lonely planet held more than he had ever expected. The bond begins. The next morning, Zach woke early, the quiet of Vaux's desolate landscape settling heavily over the compound. After yesterday's cautious success with Fang, he knew today would test the fragile thread of trust they had begun to establish. Lying on his bunk, he replayed the encounter in his mind. The tension, the cautious approach, the surprising acceptance of the brush. There was a depth to Fang, a sense of untamed intelligence and pride that fascinated Zach. Fang was more than just an animal. He was a survivor, a creature shaped by conflict, loss, and solitude. Zach dressed and made his way to the control room, where Kyra was reviewing the footage of yesterday's session. She looked up as he entered, her face impassive but her eyes curious. That was either genius or insanity, she said, replaying a segment where Fang allowed Zach to brush his fur. Most handlers don't last 2 minutes with him. You realize what kind of risk you're taking, right? Zach gave a small nod. He's not just a threat, Kyra. He's been alone for so long that he doesn't know how to trust anyone. But if we show him care and respect, maybe he'll realize he doesn't have to fight all the time. Kyra raised an eyebrow. You talk about him like he's human, but he's a beast, Zach, a dangerous one. He's more than that, Zach replied, the conviction in his voice firm. I know I can reach him. I've seen creatures like this before, ones everyone else had given up on. They're capable of change if given the chance. She sighed, reluctant but clearly intrigued. Well, good luck. Just don't get yourself killed. With a slight smile, Zach gathered his supplies and headed to Fang's enclosure. The air felt charged with anticipation, as if the very planet held its breath for what would happen next. As he approached the towering fences, he spotted Fang, watching him with those intense, molten gold eyes. There was no mistaking the intelligence in them, a sharpness that told Zat Fang was evaluating him just as much as he was assessing the alien wolf. He entered the enclosure slowly, closing the gate behind him. Fang's eyes tracked his every move, his posture tense but not aggressive. Zat could feel the weight of the beast's gaze, every nerve alive with the knowledge that he was facing one of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. But beneath the fear, there was also a spark of excitement. He was here to bridge a gap that no one had dared cross, to connect with a creature that had been abandoned and feared. "Morning, Fang," Zach said, his voice low and calm. He crouched down, pulling out the container of fresh meat, setting it on the ground as he had the day before. "Thought you might like some breakfast." Fang's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, his muscles rippling beneath his matted fur as he edged forward. He approached cautiously, his gaze never leaving Zach. After a moment of hesitation, he took a bite, his sharp teeth slicing through the meat with ease. Zach watched, fascinated by the beast's graceful yet powerful movements. Fang was a magnificent creature, his silver fur gleaming in the dim light, his eyes bright with intelligence. As Fang finished the food, Zach slowly reached into his bag again, pulling out the brush. "Remember this?" he asked softly, holding it out. Fang's eyes narrowed, a low growl rumbling from his throat, but he didn't back away. Zach took this as a good sign, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He took a step forward, holding the brush steady, waiting to see if Fang would allow him to continue where they had left off yesterday. To his surprise, Fang stayed still, watching Zach intently. Encouraged, Zach began to brush the wolf's fur, working gently through the tangles and mats. Fang's muscles were tense at first, his body coiled like a spring, ready to lash out at the first sign of danger. But as Zach continued, his touch gentle and patient, Fang began to relax, his posture softening slightly. "There you go, big guy," Zach murmured, his voice soothing. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." As he worked, Zat felt a strange sense of connection growing between them. Fang was not just a beast. He was a creature with a soul, a being who had endured years of isolation and neglect. Zat could see the scars hidden beneath Fang's fur, the marks of old wounds that told a story of survival and resilience. Time seemed to slow as Zat continued to groom Fang, the rhythmic strokes of the brush calming both of them. Fang's breathing grew steadier, his eyes half closing as he relaxed into the sensation. It was a small victory, but to Zach it felt monumental. He had crossed a barrier, reached a part of Fang that had been hidden beneath layers of fear and mistrust. After what felt like an eternity, Zach stepped back, putting the brush away. He looked at Fang, who was watching him with a curious, almost contemplative expression. There was no hostility in his gaze, only a guarded acceptance. "See, that wasn't so bad, was it?" Zach said with a gentle smile. Fang tilted his head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost like acknowledgement. Zach's heart swelled with hope. He had come to Vaux to help Fang, to offer him a second chance, and today, it felt like that chance was within reach. As Zach turned to leave, he heard a soft, rumbling sound behind him. He glanced back, surprised to see Fang following him, his eyes bright with curiosity. It was as if the beast was reluctant to let him go, drawn to the human who had shown him kindness for the first time in years. Outside the enclosure, Kira was waiting, her expression a mix of amazement and disbelief as she watched the interaction unfold on the monitor. "I don't believe it," she said as Zach approached. "He followed you. Fang actually followed you." Zach shrugged, though he couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes. I think he's starting to trust me. He's not just a beast, Kyra. He's a creature that's been through hell and survived. All he needed was someone to see him for what he truly is." She nodded slowly, her skepticism melting into a reluctant admiration. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. Just be careful. Fang may be warming up to you, but he's still a predator." Zach smiled, understanding the warning but feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. He had come to Vorks expecting a challenge, but what he had found was something more. A chance to connect with a creature as fierce and wild as the galaxy itself. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary. That night, Zach lay awake in his quarters, his mind racing with plans for the next day. He was determined to help Fang, to show him that he didn't have to live in fear and isolation. In his heart, Zach knew that he had found his purpose here on Vorks, and he was willing to do whatever it took to help Fang find his place in the world. The journey ahead would not be easy, and he knew that there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. But as he drifted off to sleep, he felt a renewed sense of hope and determination. Fang was not just an alien wolf, he was a creature with a story, a life worth fighting for, and Zat was ready to fight. Breaking barriers. The dawn on Vorks was muted, with sunlight barely piercing the thick, greyish haze that shrouded the planet. Zaf could feel the strange stillness of the place, a silence that pressed heavily against his senses. As he prepared for another day with Fang, he found himself mulling over their last encounter. The way Fang had allowed him to brush through his tangled fur was a breakthrough, yes, but it was also a reminder of how delicate this newfound trust was. One wrong move, one moment of miscommunication, and everything he'd built could come crushing down. In the early hours, Zat reviewed footage of Fang's behavior patterns, studying the subtle signs of aggression or tension in his body language. Fang was no ordinary predator. He was more intelligent, almost calculating, and Zach needed to understand him deeply if he was going to continue making progress. Each movement, each flick of Fang's ears or shift in his stance told a story, one that Zach was determined to read. As he reached the enclosure, he noticed Kira waiting outside, her arms crossed and her gaze watchful. She was skeptical, as usual, but something in her eyes had shifted. Perhaps she was beginning to see that this wasn't just a reckless mission. "So, are you ready to push your luck again?" she asked, her tone almost playful. Zach smiled, feeling a surge of excitement. "It's not luck. It's about building trust, and that takes patience." She shook her head, muttering, "Patience with a creature that could tear you to shreds. I suppose that's one way to look at it." He chuckled and entered the enclosure, heart pounding as the gate clanged shut behind him. There, in the shadowed corner of the enclosure, Fang was already watching him, his golden eyes gleaming like embers in the dim light. Today, Fang's posture was different, more open, almost expectant, as though he'd been waiting for Zach. "Morning, Fang," Zach said, his voice steady and calm. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, knowing that any sudden motion could break the fragile peace between them. He crouched down, opening his bag and pulling out another container of fresh meat. He placed the meat on the ground, keeping his eyes on Fang. The wolf-like beast's nostrils flared as he caught the scent, but this time he didn't lunge forward immediately. Instead, Fang held back, watching Zach with an intensity that bordered on curiosity. Zach took a breath, reaching into his bag and pulling out something new, a small device that emitted a low, soothing hum designed to calm and relax animals. He'd used it with other predators before, and though it was a risk, he hoped the sound would have a similar effect on Fang. As he activated the device, Fang's ears perked up, his head tilting slightly as he listened. The low hum filled the enclosure, and Zat could see a subtle shift in Fang's posture, a slight relaxation, a softening of the tension in his muscles. Encouraged, Zat slowly approached, keeping his eyes on Fang as he reached out with the brush again. To his surprise, Fang didn't pull away. Instead, he allowed Zat to come closer, his molten eyes fixed on him with an almost thoughtful expression. It was as if Fang was beginning to recognize Zach as something other than a threat, perhaps even as an ally. "You're getting used to me, aren't you?" Zach murmured, his voice soft. He began brushing Fang's fur again, moving carefully through the thick, matted tangles. Fang's breathing grew slower, his body relaxing further as the hum from the device filled the air. For the first time, Zach felt a sense of ease in the enclosure, a feeling that Fang was letting down his guard, if only slightly. Without thinking, Zach moved to stand between Fang and the approaching security team, his body a shield between the wolf and the intruders. "Stand down," he called out, his voice firm and unyielding. "He's under my care, and I'm the one responsible for him." One of the armored figures stepped forward, his visor glinting in the dim light. "We've been authorized to take control of this situation," he said, his tone cold and impersonal. "The council has deemed Fang too dangerous for rehabilitation. Our orders are to ensure the safety of the compound by any means necessary." Zach's fists clenched, a surge of determination rising within him. "You don't understand. Fang isn't just a threat. He's a living being who's been neglected and abandoned. He deserves a chance to recover, not to be treated like a monster." The figure hesitated, but the rest of the team held their ground, their weapons trained on Fang. The wolf's growls grew louder, his body coiled and ready to strike. Zach knew that one wrong move could trigger a violent reaction, undoing all the progress he'd made with Fang. In a desperate attempt to diffuse the tension, Zach activated the communicator, letting the calming tones fill the air once more. Fang's growls softened slightly, his gaze flickering between Zach and the security team. It was a delicate balance, a moment suspended on a knife's edge. "Look at him," Zach said, his voice steady but urgent. "He's responding to me, to the care and patience I've shown him. He's not a mindless beast. He's capable of trust. You just have to give him a chance." The lead figure looked at Zach, then at Fang, the tension in his stance wavering slightly. He lowered his weapon, signaling the others to do the same. "You have 48 hours, he said reluctantly. "Prove that he's under control, or we'll be back to neutralize the threat." With that, the team retreated, leaving Zach and Fang alone in the enclosure. The silence that followed was heavy, a tense, uncertain peace that could shatter at any moment. Zach exhaled slowly, relief flooding through him as he turned back to Fang. Fang was watching him, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and something else, something like gratitude. Zach reached out, resting his hand on Fang's shoulder once more. "I won't let them hurt you," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Not while I'm here." That night, Zach and Kira met in the control room, reviewing the footage of the encounter with the security team. Kira's face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "You really put yourself in the line of fire for him," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I didn't think anyone would go that far." Zach shrugged, exhaustion weighing on him. "He's worth it. I've seen something in him, a spark of trust, of connection. If we give him time, he can change. I know it." She nodded slowly, her skepticism finally giving way to belief. "Then let's make sure we use every second of that 48 hours to show them." Over the next 2 days, Zach and Kira worked tirelessly, documenting every interaction, every moment of progress with Fang. They recorded his responses to the communicator, his willingness to allow Zach near him, even the way he seemed to seek out Zach's presence, following him with a quiet curiosity. By the time the council's team returned, they were prepared. As the armored figures entered the compound, Zach met them at the entrance, a datapad in hand, filled with footage of Fang's progress. He showed them the recordings, the moments of trust and connection that had taken weeks to build. The lead figure watched in silence, his expression unreadable as he studied the footage. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting Zach's. "This is unexpected," he admitted, a trace of respect in his voice. "The council will consider your findings, but be warned. One incident, one lapse, and Fang's fate will be out of your hands." Zach nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. As the team departed, he turned back to Fang, who was watching him with those intense, knowing eyes. They had won a small victory, a reprieve from the council's judgment, but Zack knew their journey was far from over. Fang's survival depended on the strength of their bond, on the trust they had painstakingly built, and as Zack reached out, resting his hand on Fang's massive head, he felt a surge of determination. They were in this together, and he would do whatever it took to protect the creature who had become more than just a mission. Fang had become his friend, his purpose, a part of himself he couldn't bear to lose. Facing the shadows. 2 weeks had passed since the council's intervention, and life on Vorks had settled into a strange but hopeful routine. With Kyra's help, Zack continued to work with Fang daily, strengthening the bond between them. Every interaction, every shared moment of trust, felt like a small victory. Fang, once a symbol of fear and hostility, was slowly transforming. His once wary eyes now held a glint of curiosity and something even closer to acceptance. But even as Fang softened, Zack knew that the council's shadow loomed ever closer. The threat of their judgment hung over him like a storm cloud, reminding him that Fang's fate was not entirely in his hands. The council's representatives had allowed them time, but they would return, and Zack needed to prove that Fang was not just another dangerous alien predator, but a creature worthy of understanding and care. Early one morning, as Zack prepared for his usual session with Fang, he noticed Kira waiting by the control room, her face drawn and tense. "We received a message from the council," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "They're sending an inspector to observe Fang's progress. If they're not convinced that he's manageable, they'll terminate the rehabilitation program." Zack's stomach dropped. He had known this day would come, but the reality of it hit him hard. He'd fought so hard to gain Fang's trust, to show the galaxy that this creature was more than his reputation, and now everything was riding on the inspector's judgment. "When is the inspector arriving?" he asked, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. "Tomorrow," Kyra replied, her expression grave. "We need to be ready, Zack. Fang needs to be on his best behavior." Nodding, Zack knew what he had to do. Today would be crucial, a final chance to reinforce the bond he'd built with Fang, to prepare him for the scrutiny he would face. The inspector would see Fang up close, and if they saw aggression or hostility, it would confirm every fear the council had about him. But if Fang could remain calm, if he could show even a hint of trust, it might be enough to save him. With a deep breath, Zack headed to Fang's enclosure, his mind racing with plans and strategies. He would have to push Fang in ways he hadn't before, testing the limits of their bond while preparing him for the stress of an outsider's presence. It was a delicate balance, one that could either solidify their connection or break it entirely. As he entered the enclosure, Fang rose to greet him, his eyes gleaming with that familiar intensity. Zack had come to recognize the subtleties of Fang's expressions, the way his ears tilted when he was curious, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was focused. Today, though, there was a new edge to Fang's demeanor, as if he sensed the gravity of the situation. "Morning, big guy," Zack said softly, crouching down to meet Fang's gaze. "We've got a lot to do today." He reached into his bag, pulling out the communicator device and a few pieces of meat as a peace offering. Fang watched him, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent, but he didn't immediately lunge for the food as he usually did. Instead, he tilted his head, his gaze locked on Zack's face, as if trying to understand the change in his demeanor. Zack held out the communicator, letting its low hum fill the enclosure, a sound Fang had come to associate with calm and safety. As the soothing tones filled the air, Fang's posture relaxed slightly, his muscles losing some of their tension. Zack placed the meat on the ground, gesturing for Fang to approach, but the wolf-like creature hesitated, his gaze flickering between Zack and the food. "You're feeling it too, aren't you?" Zack murmured, sensing the unease in Fang's body language. "Something's coming, and it's going to be a test for both of us." Fang's ears twitched, his molten gold eyes fixed on Zach with a clarity that sent a shiver down his spine. There was intelligence there, a depth that went beyond instinct, a sign that Fang understood far more than anyone had given him credit for. Slowly, he stepped forward, lowering his head to eat, his eyes never leaving Zach. As Fang ate, Zach took the opportunity to begin his preparations. He moved closer, reaching out to brush Fang's fur with slow, steady strokes. Fang's body relaxed under his touch, his breathing growing calm and even. It was as if he knew that this grooming session was not just for comfort, but for something far more significant. "Tomorrow, someone new is going to come in here," Zach said, keeping his voice low and calm. "They're not going to understand you the way I do. They're going to see you as a threat. But if you can stay calm, if you can trust me, we'll get through this together." Fang's ears flicked back slightly, a hint of tension returning to his posture. Zach knew this was a lot to ask. He was pushing Fang beyond his comfort zone, asking him to suppress instincts that had kept him alive through years of isolation and fear. But he also knew that Fang was capable of more than anyone had ever believed. As the day wore on, Zach continued working with Fang, reinforcing the trust they'd built. He practiced calming techniques, using the communicator to soothe Fang whenever he showed signs of agitation. By the time the sun began to set, Fang was visibly more relaxed, his body language open and unguarded. But Zach knew that tomorrow would be the real test, the moment that would determine Fang's fate. That night, Zach lay awake, his mind racing with plans and strategies, replaying every interaction he'd had with Fang. He knew that one wrong move could trigger Fang's aggression, that any hint of hostility could seal his fate. But beneath the anxiety, there was a quiet confidence, a belief that Fang was ready, that he would rise to the challenge. The following morning dawned cold and bleak, the sky over Vorks shrouded in heavy clouds. As Zach prepared for the inspection, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. He had done everything he could to prepare Fang. Now, all that remained was to face the council's judgment. The inspector arrived in a sleek, dark ship, a figure of authority and detachment in a crisp uniform and a face lined with years of experience. He introduced himself as Inspector Thorne, his tone polite but distant, his eyes sharp as they took in the compound. There was no warmth in his gaze, no hint of compassion, just a cold, calculating focus. "I understand you believe this creature is capable of rehabilitation," Thorne said, his voice neutral as he reviewed the footage of Zach's work with Fang. "But the Council has strict policies regarding high-risk species. I hope you understand the seriousness of this assessment." Zach nodded, keeping his expression steady. "I understand, Inspector. I'm confident that Fang has made remarkable progress. He's not just a threat, he's a creature who's been given a second chance." Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze flickering to the enclosure. "Very well. I will observe your session with him and make my assessment." The tension in the air was palpable as Zach led Thorne to the enclosure. Fang was waiting inside, his eyes gleaming as he watched them approach. Zach could sense the unease radiating from him, the way his body tensed as he took in the presence of the unfamiliar figure. "Easy, big guy," Zach murmured, entering the enclosure with slow, measured steps. He activated the communicator, letting its soothing tones fill the air as he approached Fang. The wolf's gaze shifted to him, his body language relaxing slightly in response to the familiar sound. Thorne watched in silence, his expression unreadable as Zach began his routine with Fang. Zach moved with a calm confidence, brushing Fang's fur, speaking to him in low, reassuring tones. Fang responded with a quiet acceptance, his eyes softening as he allowed Zach's touch. It was a moment of peace, a display of the trust they had built. But then, a sudden noise shattered the calm. A metallic clanging from outside the enclosure as a piece of equipment fell, startling Fang. His body tensed, his ears pinning back as a low growl escaped his throat. Zach felt a surge of panic. This was exactly what he'd feared, a moment that could unravel everything. "Stay with me, Fang," Zach whispered urgently, holding out his hand. "It's okay. I'm here." Fang's eyes flickered to Zach, his growl subsiding as he focused on the familiar presence. Zach could see the struggle in Fang's gaze, the instinct to lash out clashing with the trust they had built. Slowly, the tension drained from Fang's body, his posture relaxing as he allowed Zach's hand to rest on his shoulder. Inspector Thorne observed in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded, his voice calm as he spoke. "It appears you were correct. He's capable of restraint, even in the face of a perceived threat." Zach felt a wave of relief, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he realized they had passed the test. Thorne turned to him, his gaze steady. "The Council will allow the rehabilitation program to continue, provided that regular assessments are conducted. But be warned, any sign of regression, and the Council will intervene." Zach nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Thank you, Inspector. I won't let you down." As Thorne departed, Zach turned to Fang, a sense of triumph swelling within him. They had faced the Council's judgment and come out victorious, their bond stronger than ever. That evening, as the sun set over Vaux, Zach sat beside Fang, the two of them sharing a quiet moment of peace. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but for now, they had won a precious victory. Fang's future was no longer bound by fear and judgment. He was free to explore the possibilities of trust, companionship, and maybe, one day, freedom. And Zach knew he would be there every step of the way.